Okay, hey everybody, I'm back for part 2, and if you missed it, my name is Kelly Slack, and I was invited to guest teach by Pearly Shell Fiber Arts. I'm actually the co-owner of Black Sheep Fiber Emporium, and I have 2 master's degrees in teaching, so I really love to teach. I have 2 self-published books, Hoppy Feet and Froth and Foam. I've made over 100 pairs of socks, and while I don't know everything, I do know a lot about socks. Today we are talking about gauge, and as I said before, this is a little bit of a sponsored segment, so we're having Socktober with Kelly, and your sponsors are Black Sheep Fiber Emporium, Kelly Slack Designs, which is me, and Pearly Shell, so make sure that you give them a little bit of love. And as always, I do make sure that I put up the videos on our Facebook page, as well as share it to our YouTube channel, and you can find us, all of us, in various places, whichever one floats your boat. So we have Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, so you can find us on your favorite social media platform. So today we are talking all about gauge, and I know some of you are going to want to shoot the messenger when I tell you it's actually really important that you make a gauge swatch for almost every pair of socks. I'm sorry. You don't have to make a gauge swatch, but I really strongly recommend it. And there's various reasons why. When it comes to fitting your custom socks to your feet, you want to make sure that you don't have a really big sock. And you do want to make sure that your sock isn't too small. And you want to make sure that your sock isn't too open. And you want to make sure that your sock isn't too tight, so it's too bubbly on your foot. It doesn't feel very good. So making a gauge swatch is actually really important to the fit of your sock. And you can do anything as small as just taking let's see if I brought my gauge swatch out. Did I bring my gauge swatch out? This could be awkward. I might have left it in the house. Oh, there's one. I was making just a little tiny swatch. This is a little tiny swatch. Just a little itty bitty guy. But this is actually a 100% wool. It's the Studio Donegal Darnie, the slightly tweedy fingering weight yarn. And I made sure that I did a gauge swatch, and it's just a little like 20 stitch by I think this is 20 stitches by 15 rows. It's just enough to get a little sense of the yarn. I cast this off, I washed it and dried it before I measured my gauge, and we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit as well. When it comes to your gauge, you want to make sure that you are using the needles, whatever needles you choose. So you might like something like the Flexies, or you might like something more in a, hang on, I've got them here, in a circular manner. And you might prefer wood, or you might prefer metal, but whatever your preferred method is, if you're using socks on 2 circs, if you're using double points, if you're using magic loop, if you are going to be using a needle that has metal tips or has wooden tips, you just want to make sure that you are using whatever needles you are most comfortable with to make your swatch as well. And there's a reason for that. We want to make sure that the socks that we are making with the swatch and the needles that we're making are going to work. So if you use double pointed needles to make your swatch, but then decide you're going to do your socks on 2 circs, then they are going to possibly have different gauge. Even though it's a, US 1, which I think, what is the US 1? It's a 2.5 millimeter, I think. Or is it 2.25? Might be 2.25. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look it up. I don't do the conversion very well. Anyway, it's really important that you use whatever actual pair of needles you are going to use for your socks, for your swatch. And again, that's because we want to make sure that that gauge swatch is actually going to tell us what we want it to tell us. And yes, sometimes your swatch will still lie. This can be why. If you swatch flat, which I did, and there's a reason, if you swatch flat and you don't swatch in the round, you may have different gauge. For me, that doesn't happen. I don't find that my gauge is very different flat versus in the round. But it might be for you. And sometimes that's the style. Sometimes it's because I'm a continental knitter most of the time. I do sometimes switch to Portuguese, or occasionally I'll do sort of a combined continental and Portuguese. I like to call it Portunental, just for fun. But if you happen to be someone who knits in a Norwegian fashion, or someone who is an English style thrower instead of a continental picker, you may find that your gauge is going to be very different when you are doing knits and purls versus just knitting in the round. And that is something that you really have to pay attention to. If you've knit for a while and you know your style, you can compensate for that. But if you haven't tested that yet, then it's really important that you make sure that you're swatching in the round for round things and you're swatching flat for flat things. When I start with a swatch, I usually cast on 20 to 30 stitches, and I usually do somewhere between 15 and 30 rows. It just depends on how big of a swatch I need and whether or not I've worked with the yarn before. If you haven't worked with a yarn before, you're going to need to make a bigger swatch for socks. It's just the way it is. If you are using a Superwash or a sock blend that has a really beautiful soft fiber in it, like alpaca or yak, you may need to make a bigger swatch as well. And that's because you aren't going to have as much memory on those. They're going to be a looser, softer, drapier yarn. And that means that we need to make sure that we're making a little bigger swatch and that we wash and dry it so that we can see what's going to happen. And that's another thing. If you're going to wash and dry your item in the washer and dryer, then you need to make sure, one, that it's a superwash, and two, that you have done that with your swatch, so you can make sure that your socks aren't going to shrink and suddenly fit, you know, your 2-year-old daughter instead of yourself. So that's also really important, is making sure. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any comments. Okay, good. And hi, Danielle, you're watching. I watched her sock video yesterday. She's making crochet socks, so make sure you check out Pearly Shell and the crochet socks with Danielle. When it comes to washing, you just want to wash it however you're going to do it. So I always throw my swatch, my little swatch, in the washer on delicate with all of the other things that I wash, because that's how I wash my socks. And then I take it out and I hang it to dry, because again, that's how I dry my socks. So if I have a new to me sock yarn that I've never used before and I'm worried that it's going to grow quite a bit, that's definitely something I'm going to do. I'm going to wash it and dry it just the way I would all of my socks. Let's see. Stitch gauge matters more than row gauge. So if you're having trouble hitting stitch gauge for a pattern, this is where it's important, for a pattern, then your stitch gauge matters more than row gauge. So if you need to go up or down a needle size to more closely match your stitch size, that matters far more than your row gauge. Most of the time, designers are going to tell you to knit to a certain inch length, and that's because we all understand that it's much more important for you to hit that stitch gauge than it is to hit the row gauge, and that you can adjust your pattern a little bit on the rows to get what you want. So that's a really important thing. If you find that you just can't hit that magic number, whatever the designer says you need for your size of sock, you can adjust your pattern a little bit to fit. You can throw in an extra purl that is a seam stitch in the back of a sock. It's a faux seam stitch. You can add an extra knit somewhere and decrease it away later. You may find that if you have a wider calf, that you need to add more stitches at the beginning of your sock and then decrease them away as you come down the leg. And so you might have a little bit of a shaped gusset at the top of your calf that narrows down into the heel of your sock. And we'll talk about that when we talk about measuring feet tomorrow. I know, don't you love these lead-ins? When I am designing socks, a lot of times I look at the 80% rule. So I always take my swatch and I do my gauge, and if I'm getting 7 stitches per inch and my ball measures 8.5 inches, and I know that that is also going to fit around my calf where I like my socks to fit or sit, either way, then I'm going to take 7 times 8.5, multiply that together, and then I'm going to take that number and multiply it by 0.8. It's the 80% rule. And the reason we do that is because we do want a little bit of negative ease. Negative ease means that the stitches have to stretch a little bit to fit around something, whether that's your arm, your belly, your chest, or your foot, or your head. It works for hats too. But it's really important with socks that you have negative ease so that your stitches have to stretch to fit a little bit, because we talked yesterday about how holes can happen. So here's yet another pair of socks that I have that I've darned because this was thin and I didn't want this to wear out. So you want to make certain that your socks fit fairly tightly to your feet so that they don't wear as fast, so that you end up with socks that last longer so you don't have to darn them as much, right? So it's really important when you are adjusting a pattern or when you are designing socks to fit your feet that you take into account that you need to have that negative ease so it fits around your leg. It doesn't really matter what technique, and we'll talk about techniques later. If you like these Hayas, I think these are flexi somethings or other, flyers, I think it's the Addy is the flexi flip, or whether you like to do double pointed needles. I'm a double pointed needle gal. I love double pointed needles, and that's what I tend to gravitate towards. You can use any technique for any sock, pretty much no matter how the pattern is written. You might have to do a little juggling with where you're putting your stitch markers, and you might have to think about it a little bit, but for the most part, unless it's a flat sock pattern, I should add that caveat. There are flat sock patterns out there. You could knit those on straights, but we're ignoring those for now. All of the sock patterns in the round. You can use any style of technique when it comes to, again, socks on 2 circulars, magic loop, double points, or the Haya flyers, the Addy flexi flips. And I do believe that both Pearly Shell and Black Sheep can get all of your lovely needles in if you need them. I think Heather sells mostly the Leica is what she told me. I hope I said that correctly. I might not have. And we really like Chowgu and Haya at Black Sheep. And I'm a huge fan of signatures, but they're not for everybody. So, but again, I love double points, and they have really nice sharp double points. And so are my Hayas for that matter. I love them. When you're measuring your gauge, there are different ways to do it. So I actually have a sock ruler. This is one of my favorite little tools because I can stick this into my sock down into the heel so that I can measure to the top of my cuff, and I happen to like 9 inches from my heel to the top of my cuff. And as I'm knitting, I can also stick it down. Let's see if I can get this all the way down. It works better when your toe isn't closed, but I can get it all the way into the bottom of my sock, and I can measure that down there. When you're measuring your gauge, it's really important that you measure all the way across your swatch, and you also take a look at the stitches in the very center of your swatch, the very center of your swatch. And you'll lay your swatch down and grab, I don't know if I brought it out, a tape measure, and or there are several different kinds of like magnifying glass type, and or let's see, they have a cutout and or a cutout type of stitch gauge measuring item. And you can use those as well to measure your stitches. I always like to take both those measurements. I like to go all the way across and say if I have 20 stitches that I've cast on, this measures 3.25 inches, then I will divide you know, my 20 stitches by 3.25, and that will give me a really good number. And it's usually something like 7.15 or 7.25 or 7.35. It's a really weird number. But it works well because that helps me to be more precise when I am doing my gauge measurements. And then again, I always go right in the middle of my swatch and check my stitches and my rows, because that's going to give you the most accurate measurement in addition to doing all the way across and up and down. So I don't have a ton of time left, but I hope that that's a good intro, good primer for gauge. I've talked about it before. I'll talk about it again, I'm sure. If you need more info about gauge, you can always check out my YouTube channel. And don't forget that this sock segment is Socktober with Kelly. It's sponsored by Black Sheep Fiber Emporium, myself at Kelly Slack Designs, and Pearly Shell Fiber Arts. So make sure that you are giving them some love and checking out their Facebook, Instagram, let's see, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikToks. So I will see you guys again tomorrow. Be safe, be healthy, be happy, and sock month! Yay!